I'm going to make a pretty traditional pesto. We'll make one tweak to that. And again, I'll be using a food processor for this because it's just quicker and easier. But if you instead have a mortar and pestle at home, you could also do that. I would just say, we'll give those instructions in the recipe, but just add the oil slowly, just as you need to pound things up, and pound the garlic into a paste as the first step. And then you can otherwise follow the recipe and it works pretty well, but it does make a giant mess. So you just want to make sure that you're wearing something that you don't care if it gets some green oil on. So this is, again, neater and quicker. So we'll use this. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some chopped garlic to the food processor. And then the non-traditional thing I'm going to do, which will improve the appearance at the dinner table, is instead of the 3.5 cups that are mentioned of the fresh basil, I'll use 1/2 cup less of that and replace it with 1/2 cup of parsley. The reason for this is once basil is chopped up, it tends to brown pretty quickly, but the parsley doesn't. So even if you get a fair amount of browning with your basil, then you'll still have some nice green flecks in there from the parsley. But you don't want to replace so much of the basil with parsley that it's a strong parsley flavor. It's certainly tasty if you do that, but it's not going to taste so much like a traditional basil pesto. And I'll put the parsley and the garlic in there, and then some of the olive oil. And then we just want to chop that up pretty well. We'll add the rest of our ingredients. And again, I'm going to use the pulse function just because we do want a little texture to remain at the end. We don't want it to be, totally smooth puree. That's also why I'm using a food processor rather than a blender, since a blender tends to make things smoother. We also aren't going to have quite enough liquid in here to be able to blend well in a blender. So this is definitely you're well served by a food processor. You have to stop and scrape this down a few times. The big pieces of garlic get stuck on the side. And it's okay if the pieces of garlic are still a bit bigger than you'd like. You mainly want to break down that parsley. There'll still be some chopping as we add the other ingredients. And if you don't want to take your whole food processor apart, you can just take off the top and put things through the feeding tube here too. So now we're going to add pine nuts that I have toasted. And you can actually use any kind of nut you like, the flavor of in pesto. Walnuts are a really common substitution. They're much less expensive, easier to find. And if someone has an allergy or intolerance to pine nuts, that's a good replacement. So you can see, it's a way to not take it apart, but it takes a while to get this much basil in through the feeding tube. You don't have to worry about it turning on. There's a safety on most of these that will prevent it from turning on while you're putting things in the larger part of the feeding tube. The reason I'm putting these things in stages is if we put in the Parmesan and basil right at the beginning, then we blend it so much that the basil, the more it's chopped up and the longer it's chopped up, the more brown it gets. And then the Parmesan will actually turn into kind of a paste, which we don't want to happen. So it's already pretty finely shredded up. And this is going to be as good as the quality of the Parmesan that you use. So my favorite is a Parmigiano Reggiano. It's a long-aged Parmesan. It has a really superior flavor to a lot of others. Other people will make the argument that you're putting it in with really strongly flavored basil. So, maybe you could use a less expensive Parmesan. It's really up to you. What I would not use is I would not get the powdered Parmesan from the store. I would use, something that you get in a block and grate it up. Even if the same kind is sold already grated up, a lot of times they'll put, different compounds to help keep it nice and sprinkleable in shreds. And so it's not always purely Parmesan when you're getting it already shredded. So that's a tip I'd give you regardless of what kind you get. We're just going to pulse this again and stop and scrape down the sides if bigger pieces are getting stuck. And I'll pour the rest of the oil in as well. There's usually a little hole in the top of this, whatever brand of food processor you have. There's a little tiny hole. It's hard to see on camera. But if you pour the oil in, it will actually just drizzle in slowly while you do this. The other tip I'll give you is when you go to use this pesto, make sure you're mixing it into something that is not in a hot pan on the stove, because the more heat you apply to the basil in the pesto, the more browning you're going to get. So if you're cooking pasta and mixing this with a hot pasta, do it in a mixing bowl or do it off the stove. I think this looks pretty good. There, so you can see there's still a little texture in there. And I often don't put quite as much oil as you might normally put in a pesto, because what I'll show you now, which is a good tip for storing it. So I'll usually make sure that I have, just a clean glass jar. This is if I'm going to use it the next week or so in the fridge. If you're making a lot ahead, say you have a garden, you grow a lot of basil, you need to put it away somehow, then I would actually line an ice cube tray with some plastic wrap, or just use a dedicated ice cube tray that you don't care if it smells like garlic. And you can freeze 1 ounce little aliquots of the pesto in there, and then you can actually take them out frozen and put them into hot pasta, and they'll just dissolve as you stir it. You don't have to defrost it or really do anything special to it that way. See that beautiful green color, and the sharpness of the herbs and the umami of the Parmesan. It just really gives like a beautiful bright flavor with some complexity underneath from the umami and the saltiness of that cheese. If you're not someone that's going to be having dairy or cheese, then I'll show you a totally plant-based version in a separate video that still tastes very similar to this. If you have a pretty much full jar, great, but regardless, you just want to smooth out the top. You tap it, or use a scraper to get as many of the air bubbles out as you can. It's really the air touching that chopped up basil that makes the browning happen. And then you can just put either plastic wrap directly on top if you want to limit adding more oil, or you can just put a thin layer of olive oil on top. Again, just kind of making a barrier between the pesto and the air. And that oil will prevent that from getting through. And then you can cover it with a lid or plastic wrap, put it in the fridge. And then usually what I'll do is this oil will harden, and you can kind of just push it off to the side, scoop down with a spoon, get a scoop or two out, and then smooth it out over the top again and put it back in the fridge. So again, it will last about a week, 1 to 2 weeks. Usually, it starts to get a little yucky toward the end of 2 weeks if you're not careful at covering it back up. But again, if you're not going to use it in that amount of time, I highly recommend the freezing method. And what I didn't mention is when you have it in those ice cube trays, as soon as it's frozen, you can pop it out and just put it in a Ziploc bag or container and store it in a more efficient way. So again, this is our traditional pesto with the little tweak to add the parsley to keep that nice green color even when the pesto warms up. And next we'll move on to the plant-based version.